Hello and welcome to another Hangout, a Google Plus Hangout. Today my guest is Katherine Wiid. Katherine is a language and behaviour profiler. I think I've got that right, Katherine, so
Yeah,
welcome to the Hangout.
thank you.
Tell us a bit about what an LAB profiler does.
Well, it depends. Language and behavioral profiling is actually a psycholinguistic tool, and so few people have actually heard about what that is. So, if I put into perspective for you, unlike a psychometric test where you get people to sit in front of a screen typically and think, what am I like when I do this and when I do that? We just listen to what people are saying and how they're saying it. And from people's language patterns, somebody like myself can understand what your 14 unconscious motivations are in a very specific context. So the context that I tend to focus on is work.
Okay, so I take it you mostly work with managers, largish companies who are looking to recruit the right people and help them to do the best they can in their job. Is that right?
I do. That's one of the ways that I apply it quite successfully, working with HR and managers to really be thinking before they even start recruiting, because that's when the trouble starts, to look at the job description and behind each of the skills and the tasks, think, how do I want that person to be motivated? And it can be any size of organization. In fact, I work with lots of business owners and small companies as well.
Okay. The reason I asked Katherine to come and join us today on the Hangout is that I work with a number of business owners too, small business owners usually, and I'm always urging them to get out there into the world and promote themselves, to tell everyone how wonderful they are. And at a recent workshop, I had a palpable withdrawing from that suggestion, where people felt that they could happily promote their businesses, but if it had to be them doing it, or if they had to promote themselves in any way, that felt really uncomfortable. And this got myself and Katherine into a conversation about introversion and extroversion, and whether some people are more likely to succeed in business because they're extrovert and they go out and they're happy to sell themselves and sell their business, or whether the introverts have other strengths that may make them equally successful. So, Katherine, first of all, I guess I should ask you if you would define the introversion extroversion, because I understand it's a lot more complex than most of us realise.
It is, and it depends on those two words. I mean, Carl Jung in the early 1920s came up with the first concept of introversion, somebody who perhaps lives a little bit more in their head, inside themselves, doesn't need as much external stimulation, and an extrovert who loves to dive into the activity and is more interested in um, getting more feedback. So those are very broad terms. And those are the ones that if you read books like Susan Cain, who wrote Quiet, which I think is an absolutely fantastic book, really describes a lot of the science and thinking that's gone into those two terms. But they are very broad, and they probably do not do a lot of people justice, which is where we had that conversation, didn't we, Anne?
Mhm. So, can you help us to try and decipher or give us some clues as to how we can perhaps recognise which we are personally, and perhaps how to recognise other people?
Well, in order to do that, I think I'd prefer to use slightly different terminology, if that's okay, and get a
Mm.
little bit more specific. In the lab profiling world, we tend to break introversion and extroversion down into lots of different meta programs. And these are the motivational triggers that people have in a certain context. So an introvert is an internal because the source of their motivation comes from within. So if you felt that you like to gather information, a lot of information from the outside, and then run it through your internal reference frame point and make decisions and judgments based on what you know, your internal standards. You you are more internally referenced. Somebody external does the same thing, takes information, but needs that information from the outside, and then they make sense based on that external information, much more adaptable because they're not making judgments based on their own internal standards. So I like to sometimes think of them as being solar powered because that energy is coming from outside of them rather than from within.
Okay. So I guess is there an easy way to try and identify who we are ourselves? Because I think some people do get very confused about this, don't they? They think they're one thing, but can actually be another. I mean, I guess I'm a prime example of that. Most people think that I'm an extrovert because I'm very sociable. I like going to networking events and things like that, and I'm very confident. But I know inside of me that I'm really much more internally referenced. So how does that confusion come about, and how can we try and untangle it?
I think the way to untangle it is to understand some of the other patterns. So what you've described to me, Anne, about yourself is that you're able to be confident and talk about things and use your initiative and be out there in public, but then you like to come back and quietly perhaps reflect and think about things. And then once you've thought about things, you're happy to go out and talk to people again. Now, that is what I'd call a reactive and an internal pattern. So somebody who's reactive likes to think, analyze, and understand, perhaps before getting up there and speaking. And at the same time, you have your internal standards and you make judgments based on what you already think is right. So already there are two meta programs there. And this is where I think, and we've been in a discussion before, where we've gone around the room and people say, well, do you know, I'm not reflective. I like to just get out there and do things and make things happen. Well, in that case, they're an internal plus they're proactive. So this is where it gets confusing and where it's not useful to just have the label of you're an introvert or you're an extrovert. It's what are you motivated to do at that moment in time?
Okay, so let's look at this a slightly different way and see if we can be more helpful to people who would like to perhaps be more out in the world, be more confident about presenting themselves or their business, but they do feel that they are uncomfortable doing that. So what's the best way for those kinds of people to make the most of their own strengths?
Well, I think the best way is to firstly understand what triggers their motivation. If they don't like walking into a massive room of people at a big networking event because that's just too much stimulation and they find it overwhelming, well, there might be a better way of networking or getting to know people, and that could even be doing something like this, because it's just you and I. I know there are other people watching, Anne, but actually it feels for somebody who perhaps finds the other a little bit overwhelming, a great way to network and connect with people. So social media is a good way. I think it's understanding yourself first and then not using it to hide behind, but to actually find what those strengths are about it and make the most of it. Because as with any pattern of behavior or any behavior, there's always a pro and a con.
Okay. Now, going back to our original question about being successful in business, do the people who are more internally referenced make better managers, for example? Do they have traits that allow them to bring out the best in other people and perhaps grow their business in that way?
It's interesting, Anne. I think on your website or on the Google Plus, I'd put a link to an article, and it's called Why Introverts Now Rule the World. And it claims that, if I can just find it, that introverts make better bosses. And when I read this, I was thinking, well, in some ways they do, and in some ways they don't. Now, if we think about somebody who's internal, very good at using your initiative because you don't need to be told what to do or get outside feedback to start doing something. So self-starters, so entrepreneurs need to be, to an extent, internal. However, if they're so internal, then they're never going to be flexible and adaptable as to what other people are thinking. There needs to be some external there as well, because you need to be tuned in to your audience. The same with managing people. Yes, as a manager, you need to set standards and you need to have guidelines, and it's wonderful if you're managing other internals because they don't like you leaning over their shoulder and telling you what to do. Perfectly happy to use their initiative, check in every so often. But it's interesting, some of the biggest issues that I've been called in to solve in organizations between employees and their managers are when you have an employee who's very external, who needs a lot of feedback, and the manager was very internal. And because she doesn't need feedback, she wasn't giving any feedback. But as soon as they understood that about each other, the relationship really improved. So again, it's about understanding how much you need of one versus the other.
So in a team situation, what's the best way to make sure that everyone gives of their best? Because, I can remember examples where the externally referenced person has been, almost a show-off, bouncing about and full of ideas and quite noisy, whereas the quieter members of the team often don't get a word in edgeways. And, to that point, when I run mastermind groups, we go around and everyone has a turn to speak so that the quieter people do get a chance, and often their ideas are really worth listening to.
Yes. Well, you're doing a good thing there, Anne, because that's the thing about some internals or introverts is love to listen, can listen all day, gather information and not actually say anything, but will say something quietly afterwards, which isn't always very helpful. What I would encourage teams to do is to learn to speak using certain language that will motivate someone who's different to them. So as an internal, for example, I tend to be a little bit more internal. Naturally, I use suggestive language. So I'll say, well, Anne, what do you think? Should we do this? My thoughts are this, but what do you think? Now, somebody extrovert and who likes to talk, as you've been describing, if I use that kind of language, they might think, oh, it's a bit weak and get on with it. What are you trying to say? Whereas what I need to be doing and adapting to with that person who's very external is to match them, to be very direct, perhaps speak more concisely and not use suggestive language and just dive in, which of course makes me go eek, but I've got to switch that and do it, and then that communication will work. And the same thing for externals. The minute they just say to me, well, may I make a suggestion, or what do you think? I'll be perfectly happy.
That's really interesting. I read a blog recently about introverts making the best salespeople, especially in these days with social selling, which is much softer. And we all have this idea in our heads, don't we, of the typical successful salesperson being quite extroverted and extremely confident and taking the lead and all that kind of thing. But this was suggesting that actually the listening skills are really much more important there, and finding out what it is that people need before you make any suggestions about selling them something.
Absolutely. Listening is a hugely important skill, especially in sales. And I heard from somebody, in fact, who I studied with. He is a sales enabler, and he works with teams and recruits them, and he gets people on board to help train them. He said the best person who's ever trained his sales team to really listen was a hostage negotiator. And I was absolutely amazed. I thought, he said, because it's all about listening. And exactly with what we're doing now and with behaviors and with the layer profile, what you're listening for in a hostage negotiation or in a sale is you listening for somebody else's beliefs and values as well as their language patterns. So, I mean, listening is fantastic. And extroverts or externals can also learn to do that as long as they know what they're listening for and that there's a purpose to it. But otherwise, they're more inclined to just want to fill the room with chatter and noise and stimulation.
Mm. So is there any research that can show that the introverts or the extroverts are more likely to be successful in business?
There's no definitive research, Anne, and it's something that I'm always on the lookout for, as you can imagine. I think it depends on the industry, the sector. There are two characteristics that Patrick Lencioni, who you might have heard of, he writes the most wonderful business books. He says that make people really successful in business, and that number one is humility, and the other is hunger. So if you think about it, an extrovert or an introvert can be humble, and they can also be hungry and want to be successful. So to just make a broad sweeping statement and say that introverts or internals, because they're more likely to listen and be quiet and thoughtful, make better business leaders or are more successful in business, I think is perhaps taking it out of context and not being very an accurate reflection on people's ability.
Mm. And when you came along and did the workshop for us, Catherine, you had a couple of really surprising examples. I think you surprised most people in the room with those. Would you like to just talk us through them?
Yes. When we think of famous people, and in fact, one of the things, I mean, it's quite recent, and was just this last weekend. I was watching the US Open. I love watching tennis. And if we look at two perfect examples of the two different patterns, Djokovic was playing Andy Murray. And if we look at Andy Murray, he will hit a shot and he'll talk to himself and he beats himself up and he murmurs and he doesn't even hear the crowd. Djokovic will play, and when he's played a great shot and he thinks he's done well, he needs that external feedback. So he will be doing this with his hands and he gets the crowd roaring and he absolutely feeds off it. And I've noticed his performance dip when the person he's playing is being supported more by the crowd, because he really needs that.
Oh, now that's really interesting. Like you, I'm a great tennis fan, and it really annoys me when Djokovic does that.
He really does it.
Yes, I do. I think he's being unsportsmanlike and big-headed and all kinds of things, all kinds of judgments I make about him because of the way he behaves on the court.
So what do you do when he then takes his shirt off at the end, strips off?
Well, to me, it's part of the same kind of pattern. Yeah. I'm not impressed.
It's interesting. However, if we move away from sport, two examples that just leapt out at me. I was thinking about, people out there in the limelight, and the one who I, really followed quite a lot because of being South African originally is Maggie Thatcher. And she's not here to defend herself, so I'm not going to say anything that I shouldn't. However, she was off the scale internal. And it was, I think, in the 1970s, 80s, she was at a massive meeting of all those Commonwealth countries, and 49 representatives said, yes, we want to impose sanctions against South Africa because of the apartheid. And she was the only one who said no. And her attitude was, there's something wrong with them. She wasn't interested in what other people thought or taking the consensus. So off the scale internal. And there's this wonderful picture that I know you've seen that I've shown where she actually is sitting like this, looking upwards, and you can almost see the cogs going on in her head. She's processing stuff and her hands are pointing inwards towards herself. Good indicators of an internal pattern, quite a blank expression on their face. The opposite, of course, Sir Alan Sugar on The Apprentice, or just Sir Alan. You know, there's this wonderful picture of him with his arms stretched out and almost like he's drawing in information and feedback. And he's probably arrived at the studio with his chauffeur-driven Phantom Rolls-Royce with his personalized number plates. And I know for a fact that everyone has to call him by his title. And if you don't, you sort of get into trouble. So he is very different to Maggie Thatcher. And he's probably been as successful in business because of that, because he's adaptable to what people need, and that's why Amstrad was such a success.
So in a typical business relationship, is it a good idea for an introvert and an extrovert to team up? Do you think that makes a stronger team, or perhaps even in any other kind of life relationship as well? Does it make for a better team, a stronger team, or are they just so incompatible they'll always be having rows?
I think they could be incompatible, definitely, until they've done their lab profile and understand how to talk to one another. One of the great success stories of compatibility and two extreme opposites was Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs. Steve Wozniak, who was quite a lot older, was working at Hewlett-Packard, and he talks about living in his head. And he would sit at sort of 12 o'clock, 3 in the morning in this dark cubicle working on the first prototype of an Apple computer, whereas Steve Jobs was still at high school then, and they were given a school project to do. So he just thought, oh, I'll call up William Hewlett, the one of the owners of Hewlett-Packard, which he did, and he said, I need some parts for my project. And William was so incredibly impressed, he offered him a internship, and eventually Steve Jobs started working there, which is how the two of them met. But if you look at that introversion, that sort of living in his head of Steve Wozniak, and Steve Jobs just was out there and in your face, and what a fantastic combination to make one of the most successful companies that we'll ever know. I think that's a really good example of when it works.
Yeah, although they did famously fall out as well, didn't they?
They did. But then I think in any marriage or any relationship or any close working relationship, you will have your moments. I guess it's just understanding how you can get it back on track.
So if people can't find a compatible opposite, or someone to complement their strengths, is it ever a good idea for people to try and change themselves, or to try and perhaps be something that they're not naturally, in order to overcome, being too shy or too reticent about things?
I would say it's always good if you understand how you motivated in a certain context, and you understand the pros of that. That's great, but there will always be a downside, and the downside of, we know, for example, Maggie Thatcher was to be an autocrat. Well, that's a little bit dangerous. So yes, surround yourself with people who are different to you, who you trust, who can give you a different perspective. And if you understand as well what that gap is that you need to work towards, because you and I are internally referenced, doesn't mean that we can't become external, that we can't be open to other people's ideas and take that on and actually adapt. So this is the interesting thing about motivational patterns. It's not a fixed way of being. We can learn to adapt and change and surround ourselves, or have the right sort of environment that will bring out the best in us and actually allow us to grow.
That's really, really interesting. Katherine, could you finish off by telling people perhaps where to find more information about all this if they're interested. You've referenced Susan Cain's book, Quiet. Are there other books or blogs that go into this in more detail? And perhaps your own website as well, and the blog that you write would be good if you would tell us a bit more about that.
If on the subject of introversion, Susan Cain did a wonderful TED talk, so great starting point to look at. The other book that's really good if you want to know more the technicalities of the lab profile is Words That Change Minds by Shelley Rose Charvet, who I've been very fortunate over many years to study with. She developed the lab profile as we know it today, and it's a fascinating read. And she has a website, Success Strategies, with some blogs and videos on there that are quite fun. And then we have the Recreon website, recreon.co.uk, and the occasional blog. And I do give quite a few talks and always happy to just chat to people about it and meet up when I'm in Cambridge because it's a fascinating topic.
Okay, that's lovely. So any last words of wisdom for people out there who are struggling to know who they are and the best way to behave?
Well, if you're not sure who you are, don't worry about it because most people don't, because we all change all the time. If 1 minute you feel you want to just go into a dark corner and the next minute you're dancing on the tables, don't worry, that's perfectly normal. And I think just to being curious, I always find the more I know about myself, the more I'm able to listen and understand others. So I think the greatest words of wisdom that Shelley Rose Charvet imparted to me and that the lab profiling is that don't try and motivate people the way you want to be motivated. Motivate them the way they want to be motivated. And try and get into their heads and understand them without judging. And that leads to just opening up wonderful lines of communication and success in business.
That's fantastic. So next time I see Djokovic, I shall understand a bit more about why he behaves the way he does and not judge him so harshly.
Oh, wonderful.
Katherine, it's been absolutely delightful talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'll put all of your details on the YouTube video on the links that come out so that if people want to get in touch with you, they can find you nice and easily. And of course, you'll be here on Google Plus as well if people want to talk to you directly. But for now, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.